Today, we're going to break down a really critical geopolitical risk assessment. It covers a pretty dramatic and, you could say, volatile transformation in India's global standing between 2024 and 2025. The report argues that what we saw was a deliberate pivot in strategy, one that came with massive consequences for the region and for the world.
And this quote, this really sets the stage. It's an incredibly stark statement from Prime Minister Modi. Blood and water cannot flow together. According to the report we're analyzing, this single phrase became the justification for one of the most drastic geopolitical moves in the region's recent history. It just perfectly captures the hardening tone we're about to explore.
So here's how we're going to walk through this. First, we'll look at India's big pivot to hard power and see how that directly led to military conflict and even the weaponization of water. Then we'll trace the ripple effects, from a diplomatic crisis with Western allies to the really steep costs back home. And we'll wrap up with the report's big question. Is India heading for strategic solitude?
All right, let's jump into Section 1, India's hard power pivot. According to this analysis, this is the absolute catalyst, the first domino that really set everything else in motion.
The core idea driving this entire shift is a doctrine the report labels offensive realism. So, what does that actually mean? Well, it's a move toward prioritizing proactive, sometimes even punitive, military action over diplomacy. This was a radical break from decades of India's established foreign policy.
And this is a great way to see just how big of a change we're talking about. On the one hand, you have the old doctrine of strategic restraint, diplomacy first, with careful, measured responses. And on the other, you have this new normal, a strategy built around preemptive strikes and a much, much higher tolerance for risk. This wasn't just a minor adjustment. It was a total rewrite of the strategic playbook.
So that brings us to Section 2, where we see how this new doctrine played out in the real world, with conflict and water wars. The analysis says these were the very first and most dramatic consequences.
Things really kicked off, as the report outlines, with a terror attack in Pahalgam on April 22nd. But the response this time, it was unlike anything seen before. Just 2 weeks later, India launched Operation Sindoor, which spiraled into the largest air battle the region had ever seen. The whole thing was so intense that it took a U.S.-brokered ceasefire to stop it, just 4 days after it began.
And of course, the moment the shooting stopped, the information war started. You had two completely different stories. India claimed it was a clean, successful operation. Pakistan immediately countered, saying civilian areas were hit and that they'd shot down Indian jets. The report really highlights this fog of war, showing how that uncertainty fueled skepticism abroad and political fights back home.
So here's the really crucial takeaway from the conflict. It established what Indian strategists started calling the new normal. Basically, asserting the right to launch these deep, preemptive strikes inside Pakistani territory. But for the rest of the world, for groups like the Crisis Group, this was incredibly alarming. It looks like it was significantly lowering the nuclear threshold in a region that's already a tinderbox.
But the escalation didn't end there. In a move that truly shocked the international community, India announced it was putting the 1960 Indus Waters Treaty into abeyance. Now, the World Bank, which is the guarantor of that very treaty, didn't mince words. They were clear. This was a unilateral action that violated international law. The era of using water as a weapon had officially begun.
And this wasn't just some abstract legal threat. It had very real immediate consequences. Just look at this number. By December 2025, the flow of the Chenab River, which is a critical water source for Pakistan under the treaty, had dropped to an historic low of just 870 cubic feet per second.
Now that number might not mean much on its own, but this chart, wow, it puts it into terrifying context. The recorded low was 870. The average minimum for that same time of year, over the last 10 years, is around 4,000. The report makes it clear this wasn't nature. Satellite imagery confirmed India was using the Baklihar Dam to engineer an artificial drought downstream, and they timed it perfectly to hit Pakistan's critical wheat sowing season.
Okay, so we've seen the regional fallout. Now let's zoom out in Section 3, because this new aggressive posture didn't just cause problems with Pakistan, it created a massive diplomatic crisis with key Western partners.
So how did this all unfold? Well, it was a cascade. The crisis was kicked off by these serious allegations of transnational repression. It started with Canada, but it really blew up when the U.S. Department of Justice linked Indian officials to assassination plots on American soil. Then Canada took it a step further, formally implicating India's powerful Home Minister. At that point, the report says the forensic evidence was so strong that plausible deniability was just gone.
It all culminated with the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance issuing coordinated statements.
And here's why that mattered so much. It completely shattered the shared values narrative that had been the bedrock of India's partnerships with the West for years. Suddenly, the perception of India shifted from a friendly democratic partner to a state willing to carry out extrajudicial acts on foreign soil. And that created a huge trust deficit.
Okay, so for Section 4, we're bringing the focus back home to look at how this aggressive foreign policy came with a really steep internal price tag.
So, while all of this was happening on the world stage, what was the actual cost being paid back in India?
Well, for starters, let's look at the health of its democracy. According to Reporters Without Borders, India's press freedom rank for 2025 had sunk to 151 out of 180 countries. That's a position they classify as very serious.
And it wasn't just democratic norms that were hurting. The economy took a massive hit too. Net foreign direct investment, which is a really key indicator of what international investors think, it absolutely plummeted to a 12-year low.
This table really pulls that whole domestic picture together. You can see the low press freedom rank, the country's status as an electoral autocracy, and that really sharp decline in foreign investment, which fell to a critically low point of just 0.84% of GDP. I mean, the data paints a pretty clear picture of both democratic and economic erosion.
So you have to ask, why were investors getting so spooked? Well, the report points to a few key things. Super unpredictable regulations, the aggressive use of financial agencies against foreign firms, a practice some called tax terrorism, and a string of big-name companies just packing up and leaving. All of it meant that India largely missed its chance to capture the manufacturing business that was moving away from China.
And that brings us to our final section, strategic solitude. This is where the report basically tallies up the final score of this whole grand strategic experiment.
And this slide lays out the report's central argument perfectly. It's the grand trade-off. On one side of the scale, you have the perceived gains, projecting hard power, firing up the domestic political base, but on the other side, the immense costs, a loss of global trust, diplomatic isolation, money fleeing the country, and just making the whole region more unstable.
And so we're left with the report's powerful final question for us all to think about. In its search for what it calls strategic autonomy, is India actually risking strategic solitude, becoming a nation that's powerful, yes, but also increasingly isolated and distrusted by the rest of the world?